So I'm going to click record because what I'll do is I will edit it afterwards. So when I make all the faux pas, I'll take those and throw them away. So
that's better.
It's been about 3 months of not talking since we were last here.
Right.
At the last time we were talking, it was post January 6th. Just after January 6th. It was like a week after.
We actually met on January 6th.
Right. As that was happening.
The nonsense was going on as we were conversing with each other.
Right.
And then we met one time after that.
It's true. But now the tradition may live on, where we ask the hard questions and get the hard answers. So in that time, I know what I've been up to, but what have you been up to?
I'm currently in the process of moving.
Where to?
To 5-minute drive from where I currently live.
Okay, good.
Irby Street, across from Aldi's. You make a right as you're going south, and there are new apartments there, and I'm moving in. I was moving as early as 4:30 this morning, so I've been up for a while.
Oh, gosh.
Well, I didn't want to lose the momentum, and at the same time, we haven't gotten together in a long time, and I didn't want to miss this. So
I appreciate your you allocating conversation so high on your priority list. That's a good thing.
The movers actually come tomorrow for the heavy stuff, and all the light stuff has been moved.
That's good. You should have asked. I love helping move people, move stuff.
Oh,
I have a big friggin' van. Tons of stuff goes in there. It's like a TARDIS. There's more space on the inside than on the outside, I swear.
I did not know.
That's fine.
You and I could have handled everything quite nicely. There's just not a lot of stuff left.
I see. That's good. That fewer possessions. Possessions own you. You don't own the possessions.
I've been downsizing for quite some time.
It's very good. I find that people, particularly later in life, will find the utility of actually downsizing. Right. So, in the time that we have talked, all this happened.
Yeah, I'm
so
really surprised.
Yeah, so Jamel Lied is the guy who runs Lied Transportation out of this area, and he happened to walk by. He asked me if I was shooting a podcast. I told him I was, and I asked him if he'd like to see my setup. And he was very intrigued and bought a bunch of stuff and was like, "Hey, Brian, come check it out." And from there, we kind of got to talking about what exactly he wants to do. I think it's a noble cause what he has for 119. So 119 is the address of the home where he grew up, and mostly it's about giving a voice to the unvoiced Black American experience, which is tremendously important because of so many reasons, right? But fundamentally, the things that the reason why I stayed, I was helping Jamel first, and now I was working with him. Well, now I'm still working with him. Now I'm sort of his partner. He's a good man, and the people who gravitate towards them are also good people.
Good.
Children come here a lot. Parents will bring their children, and the children are A students, honor roll students. So that's the kind of quality of people that tend to come around Jamel. So he's a good influence.
Good.
Yeah, and it's been okay. So 119 is growing steadily and surely, and I do technical aspects to it. So I'm in the process of, like, all this stuff is 3D printed, like the headphone mounts and the little coasters and stuff. The geometrically complicated candy dish, those sorts of things. And I'm in the process of making our own cameras from scratch. So it's going to be like a little Raspberry Pi and a little Sony IMX 219 camera sensor module and some drivers to load it, and then just spit it out over HDMI, go to a switcher and all this great stuff. So it's a good technical challenge. So it's been good. But I've mostly been occupied with chronicling, like, the similarities between America as she is now and post-climax Rome. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. How do you feel about current events?
Depressed.
That's a good response.
COVID-19 crisis, I think, is due to foolishness. People resistant to getting vaccinated. It's striking primarily the unvaccinated, and there's absolutely no excuse for it, in my opinion. And I have family members who refuse to get vaccinated.
I hear you. I agree, but I also understand the dissenters. So, full disclosure, I'm fully vaccinated. Moderna was what I took.
Same here.
Yeah,
exactly the same.
Now, did you have a high fever for 2 to 3 days?
I had weakness. I had body aches and pains after the first shot.
Okay.
Second shot, nothing. And it's supposed to be the opposite.
Right. That's what I had. Was the second shot kind of spiked my immune system and got me. I was in a brain fog for like a week after. And another friend of mine in Canada had the same Moderna shot and experienced pretty much identical symptoms. But that said, I've recovered and I haven't noticed anything. Yeah, I'm not growing any strange appendages or anything like that. I'm not glowing in the dark. So I'm not magnetic. Did you see that people have been sticking magnets on their arm?
Several friends of mine have come down with COVID-19, all of them older. One passed away within a week.
Sorry to hear. How old was he?
He was in his 70s.
Okay.
All of them are in their 70s. Another one, New York City, survived. Two of them in Bennettsville. This was last year, the middle of last year. One of them still has after effects, terribly fatigued.
Persistent.
He's about 73 now.
How long ago did he have it?
Better part of a year now.
He still has after effects after a
He
year.
still has after effects. We just got together July 27th. It was somebody's birthday, and we all met at the Indian restaurant. And
Permanent debilitation. That's yeah. So let's talk about those dissenters who won't get vaccinated, or really what they're dissenting, or subconsciously what I would assume they're dissenting, is they don't trust the institutions and authorities that we have available to us. And that's a fairly well-founded thing. Like, that's fair. Fair. I think,
and yet it's those same institutions that sponsored polio vaccination, smallpox vaccination.
Right.
And when was the last time, this isn't original at all, that we had a polio outbreak or a smallpox outbreak? And it was government-sponsored vaccination, measles, mumps.
we eliminated it in the 40s. Iron lungs haven't been manufactured, thank God, since...
All of these things, government-sponsored, very effective. And I've heard all the arguments. I know what their fears are. I think they're misguided. I think that they're stupid, quite honestly, to be sarcastic.
I think that they're wrong. I don't know if they're necessarily stupid. On average, the average vaccine advocate...
Stupid does not necessarily mean low IQ.
Okay.
I have relatives who have high IQs who refuse to get vaccinated for idiotic reasons.
I think I agree with you.
A sister-in-law of mine, very, very bright, says she doesn't want that stuff in her body.
Has she ever smoked a pack of cigarettes in her life?
Probably not.
Probably not.
But she'll let herself be exposed, her children, her grandchildren,
Right.
potentially be exposed because she has a silly notion that she doesn't want
You'll need...
messenger RNA in her. I mean, like...
You can't help folks, but while I don't excuse anti-vaxxers, I mean, because I don't think they're right. It's pretty evident that vaccines are probably the foremost effective treatment that we have, preventive treatment for infections of any kind. They have the best track record. But I do feel and understand the response for skepticism to institution, and there are so many social effects after COVID-19, and there's so many social costs of COVID-19. Responding, politically capturing or politically capitalizing on a global pandemic leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. We rely on the public making the choice to get vaccinated and adopt procedures which will drive the R value, the replication value of COVID-19 below half or below 50-50 and drive it to extinction.
Right.
We're not a totalitarian regime where we can demand that everyone follow these things. It wouldn't work. We just don't have the apparatus. The state apparatus is not strong enough in America to force people to do that, nor would I want to. No one would want to.
That's correct. I agree.
So when you have the political capitalization of the pandemic, people protesting in person to vote by mail, and it's perceived that there's some funny business, unsurprisingly, people will, that skepticism will come up and people will not cooperate. That's not what you need in a pandemic. Now, COVID-19 as a virus has it's insanely aggressive with how effectively it spreads. It's probably one of the most infectious diseases, like with a case fatality rate above like 1 in 20,000 that have maybe ever existed. And the other thing is that its case fatality rate is actually quite high. It's at roughly 2%. And that's 2% for the general population. It's selective over which demographics it kills. So when you said you knew someone personally who passed away, Dunbar's number is 150. So typically people will have about 150 people that they know. With a case fatality rate of 2%, you'll know roughly 2, maybe 3 people who could die if all of them became infected. So right now, there's only 50 million or so cases of COVID-19, I'm guesstimating, in the United States. So that's 1 in 7. So 1 in 7 of 150. So your group of people is selected for older people, and you know someone who's died. I don't know anybody who knows anybody who died. Well, and now I do, right? So that's kind of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the virus that will spread and kill people who are vulnerable to it. And we haven't had an education campaign. We haven't tried to educate people on what procedures are good to adopt. People don't understand science and don't understand virology or these kinds of things. They understand social stigmas. So even if they adopt procedures, those procedures will be adopted as social stigmas rather than as like rational, is there a germ there? Should I wipe that down? Those sorts of things. People aren't perceptive of that. On top of that, on top of the political capitalization, on top of that, we also have all kinds of social hells that we've opened up for ourselves. We are now censoring a lot of speech. And I get why the censorship is excused, but it's not just one reason, right?
Let me stop you there. What speech is being censored and by whom?
On social media, your reach or your ability to use this platform to reach your friends, which is its intended purpose, is catered to where if you talk about COVID-19 and you're a content creator on YouTube, this is how media disseminates for my generation, so it's a big deal. If you talk about COVID-19 and you're not part of the establishment, then your reach will be limited. You'll be censored effectively. So because such a huge amount of the media and information that disseminates in modern times is disseminated across privately owned platforms, we can make a legal case about whether this is like go build your own Twitter. And by the way, like right-wing people did, and then that got conspired to be taken down.
Right.
But de facto, it's censorship of speech and censorship of information flow, and this is not the appropriate response to a group systemic crisis. I don't feel anyway. Like I would rather people be educated and know how to adopt procedures to.
Yeah, it's definitely a real problem. And I see your point, and I agree with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there's great harm from misinformation.
Yes.
People react to misinformation. People are not properly educated, and they react in ways that are irresponsible and irrational. Should that be censored? That's a very fine line. John Stuart Mill addressed this in his book on liberty, and also Karl Popper addressed this in numerous writings. To what extent do we allow misinformation to influence wrong information, absolutely wrong, incorrect, and harmful information to influence people's decision making? I don't have an answer for that. And it's been addressed and tackled by minds far greater than mine. At the same time, there has to be limits on dissemination of information when it is against the science, when it is demonstrably harmful, and so on and so forth. Free speech has its consequences, some legal, some not.
So
we do have laws against slander, for example,
yes,
and so on and so forth. So when people talk about free speech, it does not mean and has never meant anything goes, in spite of the popular conception that that is what is meant by it. It has never meant that, never. And self-censorship means acting in a way that is responsible, adult, compassionate, empathetic, putting other people first, and so on and so forth, acting in a mature manner. And we could go on and on using various adjectives.
Yeah, certain amounts
because people do not act in that manner, there are laws. So there are social constraints.
I would agree.
100 years ago, 200 years ago, if you insulted somebody's wife or family, you were challenged to a duel.
Yeah.
We no longer have duels.
Right. We have a cancellation culture. That's what we do.
We have and we don't have. Because, again, we have a cancellation culture, but at the same time, we have the culture where we feel we can say anything without any consequences. And you see this on social media. You see it on all kinds of groups, online discussion groups. Things, I will give you an example, linguistics discussion groups where people would say horrible, horrible things to other people, including me, that they wouldn't dare say in person for fear of being shot down or being punched in the nose or so on and so on. For some reason, the social media, the internet, email, weakens those social constraints that would normally be in place in face-to-face conversations.
Yeah, it puts down inhibitions. Very
well put, yes.
Like those...
Exactly. It lessens inhibitions.
Like a fence between dogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I too have a foot in both worlds. Being of an older generation, I know what it was like before television, as a matter of fact, let alone before cell phones, social media, you name it, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, so on and so forth, all of them.
It was just newspapers and radio.
It was newspapers and radio. I used to sit glued to the radio listening to the Lone Ranger and Hopalong Cassidy.
Media has changed. In the days of mass media, like radio, newspapers, and television, those were highly centralized media outlets, and those media outlets had to essentially represent the average of their population in order to not be thrown off the air or fail, right? And the landscape of media has changed such that now there are millions of content creators and billions of customers. So everyone exists in their own hyper niche and in their echo chambers. It's fractured into many different things. In fact, it's advantageous for algorithms. It's advantageous for platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, whatever, to silo groups of people against each other because it keeps them coming back to that platform, right? And it's advantageous for content creators to make controversial material, like with the disinformation, like the magnet on the arm thing. People did a magnet on the arm thing as a way not of telling people the truth or so, but of taking a jab at, oh my God, they're putting nanomachines in you or something like that. Like nanomachines wouldn't even be magnetic, so Faraday, so you wouldn't get them to. So anyway, those people who disseminated that harmful information did so in bad faith, and it creates sort of this.
Very well put. Yes.
It creates this echo chamber where, now a substantial portion of the population is circulating COVID-19. It's not extinct. We're a year and some odd months into 14 days to slow the spread. We have vaccination available, but people don't have enough trust in the public institutions to take them en masse. And some small fraction of the population, vaccination isn't right for. If I understand for certain doctors, in fact, I was warned against this because I have allergies, that I might be allergic, might have an allergic reaction to it. So I had to wait an extra hour to see if I was going to die. I didn't, but a disproportionate amount of the population believes they belong to this super niche group of my cousin has hay fever allergies or hay allergies, so I'm going to avoid the COVID-19 vaccination, all of them, let alone, right? So I can see how disinformation or deliberate disinformation is encouraged by the media landscape of today. And on top of that, it is done in bad faith and it is harmful. And there might be some valid arguments for censorship for deliberate bad faith, harmful disinformation. However, when you open the door to censorship and you hand that wonderful tool over to an institution, the institutions are not perfect, right? They are subject to game theoretical corruption and bad decision-making, terrible leadership, failure in leadership, right? Like there's a structural systemic problem where we have failure of leadership built in to us for future generations from now on. We will always have that.
Mm-hmm.
I can explain. We live in a globally integrated trade network of billions of people now. Roughly 6 billion people are within just the Uniform Commercial Code trade network. And there's only like 1 billion people who aren't underneath some trade umbrella. So with billions of people under your trade network, you now have a problem with increasing throughput for education. Future generations need to be assimilated into the production consumption structure of that trade network. And the way we allocate that is by giving people positions or jobs. When you do that, the process of classifying children into which jobs or where they're going to go, that's the education system. It doesn't really, primarily what it does is it classifies people. And then secondarily, it does some education. But information is so accessible that most information education is going to be done on the job and through the internet because you have access to information unparalleled. So primarily, what education is doing is classifying. When you have this problem of having to classify hundreds of millions and ever-increasing numbers of people, you have a throughput issue. And when in any process, if you have to increase throughput, you must decrease process variance. Your controls on process variance must increase in order to get higher yields and throughput. Mm-hmm. The problem with people is that self-defined process variance is the trait we know as initiative. This is incredibly important for leadership in particular, to have this high initiative aptitude. This is systemically selected out of our top brass of people. The education system is classifying children with low initiative very high, right? They might be excellent scientists, they might be excellent doctors, lawyers, whatever, but they won't necessarily have very high initiative. They'll be very good at completing the tasks given to them. They'll be very good at conforming. They'll be very good at social climbing. CEOs follow this as well. CEOs are not super high in initiative. They're very good at social climbing. Your founders might be good at initiative, but your CEOs probably won't. And the newer generations will be much less so. They need more and more structure and more institutional structure. And the institutions themselves are dysfunctional because they have a lack of leadership. So we have Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is an extremely capable scientist. Fauci did excellent work on AIDS and HIV. He's not a politician. He has very, very low I would say, and I'm not any authority on this, but I would say he has very low initiative. If you look at Anthony Fauci's stances on COVID-19 response, it's whatever is in line with what the news is saying, because he's defending his position first and foremost. He's not leading a cogent response on COVID. So what this creates is a whole compilation of you being able to say, this is what Anthony Fauci said here, and this is him contradicting himself, and this is what the CDC said, and this is the press release, and they don't match up. You can't just follow what the CDC says, because the CDC official guidelines aren't always in line with what the CDC's press releases are. These are people who are just defending themselves from being attacked, but they're in a leadership position, right? So it's like the helmsman is defending his position as the helmsman, swatting hands away from the rudder when he doesn't have the fortitude to steer it himself. And we need to get through this. This is going to be worse as time goes through, because the next generation of children will be of less process, tighter controls on process variance, even more throughput, and even more dependent on institutions that are going to be even more dysfunctional. And these are the institutions we're going into the next century with, when we now have systemic issues that need systemic solutions, but we're putting the worst possible people in those seats. So I don't give humanity or the globally connected trade network, I don't give that a high aptitude for survival for the next 100 years. Like, there's going to have to either be massive reform or catastrophe. And I don't think it's fit at all to begin with, because all of our eggs are in one basket. I mean, with a disease that had a 2% case fatality rate among certain demographics that were generally not in the workforce, that disrupted global supply chains quite thoroughly. Mm-hmm. We still have strange disruptions in like lumber and semiconductors and stuff like that shouldn't have been affected but were. So what happens when nature throws us a curveball like a Carrington event or another disease that has a 10% case fatality rate? Mind you, smallpox had a 90% case fatality rate. So like, how is the world going to do that when everybody, our quote unquote fitness comes from our, quite frankly, bullshit jobs where we're given a very narrow constraint of tasks, and it's mostly social positioning. Like, mostly what we think of as success today is where you belong on this social hierarchy that we have. It's not your aptitude or your security or how productive on a farm you are or anything to do with your own agency. It's everything to do with how well accepted you are by other people. So you're successful if you just so happen to climb up the social ladder enough to be a powerful CEO or president of the United States or something like that. That's what makes up the, yeah.
You've covered so many things.
I rant.
To address them all would be, you talked about the educational system, or hinted at it, you didn't actually say. Mm-hmm. and the low quality of the educational system. You talked about irrationality, you talked about irresponsibility, you talked about censorship. And on and on and on. We could talk for hours about each one of these things. And now we're getting into the present and the future, and it's rather a dim picture, dismal picture that you're painting.
I would agree.
Unfortunately, so would I. For many of the same reasons, I suspect.
So let's pick one. Education.
Education, quality of education is down. I look at when I went to school, and I'm talking about the 40s and 50s and early 60s. I was out of college in 65, I think. I forget.
America was going to the moon.
And fighting a war in Vietnam and so on and so forth. In any case, the average man in the street, I'm not talking about people like you and others who I've met, has a very poor ability to reason. I talk to people, and critical thinking seems to have gone out the window. They accept things.
It's like the Dark Ages.
It is sort of like the Dark Ages, and they can't write a decent sentence. They've never read a book outside of when they were in school. They pass on information that is patently false, and they believe it.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. We could go on and on and on about this, all the things that you mentioned.
So why has the education system changed such that the quality of education has gone down? We have more resources.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and while you were talking about it. When I went to school, looking at the subjects that I was taught, the main focus seemed to be to educate people. Now the focus seems to be to train people.
Classify.
Exactly what you said. I agree wholeheartedly. And whole things have been left out of the curricula. And I had to study 2 years of Latin. I had to. I had biology. I had physics.
Latin was a great... I brought this up to people about how earlier on in America, we would learn Latin. And people look at me like, oh, it's a dead language, it's absolutely useless. It's like, no, Latin is the gateway to almost all of the European languages. And all of the sciences are based off of Latin. And also you get linguistically, you get at the root of the meaning of so many things. Like it's a gateway to history and how human thought evolved. That made a huge cultural impact 1,000 years ago.
But notice the attitude that you get back, the feedback that you get. You're relevant if it's not useful in finding a job.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not useful.
Learning for the sake of and the joy of learning. Who does that? How many other people in your social acquaintances can you sit down with and have conversations like this?
It's pretty sad because most people do not live life as a journey into the profound. They don't do that. They just simply kind of do what they're implicitly told for as long as they can, and it just eats at them, and then they die.
It's the easy way out.
That's what most people are doing.
And it's sad because I have relatives who are my age who are on their last leg, who are at that point. They've never explored anything in life. One cousin in Florida, very bright.
That's terrible.
Won't eat Chinese food, won't eat Indian food. I mean,
Oh my God, they pride
really,
themselves. Hey, this is the Deep South.
very, very self-limiting.
People pride themselves on on having grown up their entire life and not moved from a 50-mile radius of where they were born.
Yeah, and when I moved down here, I was shocked. Where I worked for an engineering company in Charleston, and these were not stupid people. These were very, very bright people. Most of them had gone to Clemson or the Citadel. I called them cookie cutter people. They all thought the same way. They all had the same prejudices, the same likes and dislikes, much more than I saw in other places I had lived, California,
Interchangeable parts.
New York City, Boston. Interchangeable people, yes.
Yeah. Well, that's very good for a corporate infrastructure, right? So.
And I was used to much more diversity. When I first moved down here, the primary demographics were African Americans and Caucasians, and that was it. And that's changed. A lot of Hispanics are moving here. A lot of South Asians are moving here now.
Diversity is another strange thing. Diversity has changed so much since like the 1960s and 70s. It's like the institutions want diversity of colored people, of different colors and different whatever qualifiers, but they all want uniformity of thought and belief and ideology.
Absolutely.
This is not becoming of diversity at all, right? Like we really should not care at all about someone's skin color. We should care very much if they bring a completely different viewpoint to discussion, right? Particularly because their different viewpoint probably wasn't constructed with erroneous things, right?
That should matter. In many cases, that is suppressed.
Yeah.
Through various means, being ostracized socially, being denied raises, promotions in the workplace, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think that's happening nowadays. The prejudice is mostly about non-uniformity of ideology. If you're outed as a conservative and you work at NBC, your days are numbered, right?
Yes and no. I see it differently. You're talking about the corporate level. The same could be said about Fox News, and the same could be said about other media outlets.
Fox News, I have a different interpretation that I prefer. I understand what you mean about Fox News being conservative and what people say about Fox News being conservative. My preferred interpretation of Fox News is that it's a liberal media outlet that panders to the conservative audience. If I have a general flow of a fluid, there will be eddy currents in that fluid if it's not completely laminar. Okay, Fox News is an eddy current towards a flow to the left of media culture. It's still part of a general flow structure towards the left.
I don't see that. I see America as primarily conservative.
Maybe so.
As a society, as a whole. And there was just an article in the most recent issue of Time magazine about Tucker Carlson. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't believe half of the stuff that he says, but this is what he gets paid to say.
None of the media personalities do. They have to fill 40 hours plus a week worth of airtime. In that time, you were going to say...
Whatever happened to Walter Cronkite when you could turn on the news and you got the news?
Well, Walter Cronkite was a news presenter, right? And he was fed...
And they all are. They all are presenters. Some of them are actors as well.
But Cronkite was fed information that had to fit the broad demographic, right? In order to survive in media, you have to have a target niche, and that's going to get saturated with what content you can produce for that niche. and the majority of what any one media outlet or producer or even niche is going to say, the majority of it's going to be crazy because it's a niche. Now, if it was a very broad spectrum,
I don't know. I wouldn't use crazy. Would use slanted instead.
Well, anyway, I mean, look at Rachel Maddow or Cenk Uygur or Steven Crowder, Tim Pool, Joe Rogan. Look at those media personalities, and you have to recognize that they make so much of their living by filling huge amounts of time with content.
Content or opinion.
Well, now that's a very blurred line, content or opinion.
Now it is a very blurred line, and because people lack the ability to engage in critical thinking, right. They do not see the difference between the opinion and that which is actually newsworthy.
It's commentary. And
it's commentary, absolutely.
The other thing about news cycles is that just by the fractured million niches, or the hydra of media culture, or the way the media landscape has changed to be like a hydra with millions of heads, there's not always enough information in the news cycle to where you can present just information. You have to fill it with commentary. So you end up making echo chambers, and any one of those places is going to have 20% good points and 80% this is just craziness. This is grifting. This is commentary on something, salacious remarks to reinforce your demographic, to gain more viewership, to wrest more viewership away from someone who is more reasonable than you. You couldn't make it today as a Walter Cronkite. Like, who would listen to him? No one. People want to hear that the COVID-19 vaccine, when it's injected in your arm, is magnetic. Like, they want to hear those kinds of things. So they're going to find them. And I think it's unfair to pick on Tucker. Fair and unfair, right? It's a true point. Yes, the majority of what Tucker Carlson says it's baloney. But the majority of what everyone has to say ends up being baloney. Like, if you want to hear like the most honest person or honest personality at all in show business, I would say like Penn Jillette is probably among the top. Like,
he's a magician.
He is, yes.
I mean,
he's extremely honest as a person.
He is.
And in his comments, he'll say, in public speaking, you will say everything you have to say or even think about in your first week. And then after that, you're going to have to make up crazy shit for people to... You're just going to have to make up crazy shit, in his words. So until something comes along that you might have an actual legitimate opinion on. So that's kind of the game that they're all playing, and I don't blame them for it. Like, it's true. I can't stand Rachel Maddow or Cenk Uygur. I think that like 100% what they say is false, but I can't blame them for it, right? I look at conservatives or libertarians or Tim Pool or Joe Rogan, and I give them a pass on their crazy because that's my people. But I don't give the pass to other people who I tend to disagree with. But
why?
No, that's my bias.
Oh,
right.
Yes.
Right. But I recognize that's my bias. And
exactly. I listen to what others who have to say with whom I disagree.
I have to catch myself with the biases and be like, yes, I'm being unfair to this person. They're in an unfair position.
I don't get either Fox News or MSNBC, so I don't listen to Tucker Carlson or...
You're very privileged then.
Or Rachel Maddow. I cut out my cable, and
I do too.
I have antenna TV now.
I have small amount. I just use the internet strictly.
Okay.
Because that's how. And preferably, I just talk to people. In real life, like that's the best way to get the best information is discussion, in my opinion, or at least in my experience, I should say. So, yeah, I mean, getting over biases is very difficult, and it maybe 1 in 100, maybe 1 or maybe 5 in 100 people can catch themselves when there's a bias and calm themselves down. I used to have a bias against, or an assumed bias against Ilhan Omar. But she's fairly reasonable in a lot of things. Sometimes sound bites will be selected. She was once commenting on 9/11 about how some some people did some things, then we lost all our liberties. Okay, that was presented as a soundbite to like rile up the right against this Muslim lady from Minnesota, but she's completely correct on that. Yes, we allowed the agency of others to affect us in such a way that we lost our liberties, and we should work to preserve our liberties. Fair point, right? And after you acknowledge, or if you can get both parties to acknowledge and be aware of their biases and actively work against them, I think you can have the odds of you having a very constructive and profitable conversation go up tremendously.
We've also become an anger culture. We think we have the right to argue and yell and scream and get angry at those with whom we disagree.
Yeah.
Much more so than I remember when I was growing up. And maybe I was naive, immature. And of course, there were fights when I was growing up. I mean, there's always been fights, but still.
But you had access to physical violence in a way that kids today
there seems
don't.
to have been more engagement.
Right. Now, anger is an interesting thing.
But I come from a different part of the country, too.
Yeah, up north.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure fighting and violence is a universal language for all mammals, at least. And we don't have access to it today. Like rough play, horse play is not allowed in schools, and that's fundamental to how boys in particular develop. So it's kind of an anti-boy, pretty hostile situation when it comes to education. But what I wanted to mention was, darn, I lost my train of thought because now I'm back on thinking about education. How much of a nutcase that is. It was access to violence. Oh yeah, anger. Anger is an interesting emotion. First off, emotions tend to be the difference in reconciling subconscious with conscious. So if the conscious and the subconscious don't see eye to eye on something, the difference tends to be an emotional response, right? And anger particularly tends to be a protective response. The purpose of anger is to protect what you have. So if we hold those as good enough truths to analyze what's going on with why culture seems to be so angry, it seems to imply that subconsciously we have been fed something that's been communicated on a subconscious level very firmly, but we are not reconciling that consciously very well, and we produce an emotional response when that thing we understand subconsciously is threatened. I'll give you an example of some anger that I came into. I was having a discussion with someone I grew up with. This is the kind of kid who had like the TV on all the time. I didn't grow up with TV, thank God. And his position is we should just shut up and obey the CDC because there's no possible way you would know something that an omniscient scientist, what science says. Now, if you come at me or anyone and you say this person is infallible and you should shut up and obey, that is dark ages levels of anti-scientific. I don't have to know a lot. I just have to know enough to be able to dismiss that on principle. That's junk. Don't do that. And the tools that are available to Anthony Fauci and the CDC scientists are also available to us. Their information is public. You can just you can Freedom of Information Act them. The other thing to mention is that there are real game theoretical problems with institutions, right? Handing institutions a privileged, leveraged position creates too much opportunity to just be a little bit corrupt. If you're just a little bit corrupt on a large scale, there are massive profits to be had, massive gains. So this is one of the reasons why special interests tend to come around centralized authorities and powers, right? So there's reasons to be skeptical or reasons to question the CDC. It happens to be that the CDC has good guidelines right now. Didn't always. There was a time when Anthony Fauci, the one we could talk about was when they knowingly told us not to have masks because they were presuming that there weren't enough masks for first responders. Right? So that deception is like, if they have a history of knowing deception and our system works on public trust and you ruin that and you censor me, you're not going to win a lot of cooperation. It's just, it's not going to happen.
Right.
And explaining this to this person I grew up with merited me, you're a dumbass, you don't know what you're talking about, those CDC scientists, they know so much more than you. I'm like, full disclosure, here's my procedures. Look, I wipe things down, that if I get a package, I spray it down because there could be virus. That package was handled by hundreds of people in the supply chain, but from me to you, from where I ordered to here. And I'm fully vaccinated, and I mask in public, and I avoid close contact with old people, and I get tested every month. I don't know anybody who gets nasally swabbed every month. I've spent like probably close to $1,000 on nasal swabs at this point.
Anybody who reacts in anger to a difference of opinion, I'm paraphrasing Bertrand Russell here, it usually means that down deep inside, they know that there's no basis for their opinion.
I would say that.
They have an opinion and they're defending it, and they're taking it personally when it's challenged. Because if you can defend an opinion, and there are good reasons, they may not be always correct, but good sound reasons to the best of your ability to believe what you believe, you're not going to get angry. If you tell me that Iceland is the biggest country in South America, I'm not going to get angry.
Iceland, the largest country in South America.
I'm not going to get angry. I know that that's not the case.
Right, it's Greenland.
But no matter how strongly you defend that, you would get angry before I would, because
right.
I have the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this. I was a little bit perturbed because I grew up with this person. I'm deeply saddened because there are millions of people who think like this, and it really does make me think like this. This is the Dark Ages.
You're right.
This is literally the high priest. This is literally this is all kinds of bad, because there's millions of these people, tens of millions. There's a generation of these people who think like scientists have proved or the science says. Like, first off, the science doesn't agree on anything. If you talk to leading researchers on anything, they agree on like 95% of what's going on, and they spend 95% talking about the 5% that they don't agree on. Like, that's true on pretty much any leading research. Science doesn't say anything, and when they say that, when these kinds of people say science says, what they're starting with is their subconscious thing that they've learned from having an entire generation's worth of propaganda pumped into them since they were kids. That thing that they know as their subconsciously true, that's what they hold as what science says. And then they imagine that the actual scientists or the institutions always are there to back up what they believe. And that's not the case. I mean, like, again, I'm not dissenting with what actual scientists have said about the CC. I never have, right? I understand. I'm not a leading virologist by any means or anything like that, but I know enough to where there are simple common practices and simple understandings that don't put that those principles are good enough to get you where you need to go with this, and you don't get in conflict with researchers. But if there's like a hierophant that's like saying, I am science, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science, I'm going to say, F you. Like, that's not how it goes.
I tend to believe in science quite
Right.
strongly, with the understanding that science changes its opinions based upon new evidence, new facts, and also with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right.
I recognize that there are people who know things that I don't know. And I'm willing to accept their opinions, their advice. Now, so this brings back to the contradictions that you were talking about earlier with what Dr. Fauci said throughout the pandemic. I believe he's an honest and honorable person, and that he did indeed change his opinions multiple times on the basis of a growing body of evidence.
Yeah, new evidence coming out.
New evidence coming out.
That's certainly true.
So I don't fault him for being contradictory. I would fault him if he kept saying the same thing in spite of the fact that there was new evidence.
Yeah.
That would be reprehensible.
That's certainly...
To change your opinion based upon a growing body of evidence, new evidence, or contradictory evidence is the way to look at things. And as a layperson, my responsibility is to keep an open mind, to be slightly skeptical, but not to reject it because it disagrees perhaps with a pre-existing opinion of mine based upon nothing but, it's what I believe.
No, you can absolutely reject things based off of principle, right? It's fair to do that. Now,
to a certain extent. To a certain extent.
Yes, you could be wrong with it, and if they have compelling evidence,
you could be wrong.
Right.
Jean Harlow died because her mother was a Christian Scientist and refused to get her the medical treatment that was available at the time that would have saved her life.
Yeah. There's definitely...
So to have a prejudice or a pre-existing opinion is not sufficient reason to act irresponsibly or foolishly.
Right. The best policy to have with new or contradictory evidence or new claims is to examine the claims.
Yes.
Examine the evidence.
Yes.
Right. So certainly, Fauci and the CDC and scientists do update their beliefs as new evidence comes out, and that is what happened. But that is not exclusive to pressures, incentivized pressures, or game theoretical things in order to keep his position safe. And we can debate or try to interpret how much of each one's going on. Is Anthony Fauci repeating what the news says to keep his position safe and keep his credibility intact? Versus, is it new information? Is the new information being cherry-picked so that it backs up another position? There's a whole dynamic of things going on there, and they're not...
Very, very true. Very true.
They're not exclusive, right? So it's not he's only covering his ass. And it's not he's only responding to just perfect Vulcan logic.
We have to
evidence.
be very careful in what you're doing. What you're doing or what you're saying can be used as a rationale for rejecting the latest evidence and what we're being presented. We should look at everything critically. We must indeed look at everything critically.
Most importantly, your own position. You should be very critical.
Very well said. Yes, indeed. How many people do that?
Well,
I would say a point above zero.
Yeah, very small.
Very, very small. Yes.
Well, so and that's kind of a dismal task to be critical of your own position, because you have to have a position. Your belief structure, or what you hold to be true, is a relative map of all the knowledge and information you've been exposed to. That's what you're doing, is you're mapping information to other information.
And you mentioned a word earlier, cherry picking.
Yes.
Not only cherry picking, but you're selecting those things that agree with what you already know. This is called the confirmation bias.
Well, confirmation bias is more insidious than that even, because it's not that we deliberately or even subconsciously cherry pick information that we accept as true. It's that we literally, if our existing map structure is incompatible with new information, we literally cannot integrate it into our knowledge structure. So because of the way, and as a linguist, I think you might agree with this, we have sort of a collective dysphoria that we all collectively share. You and I aren't experimentally verifying everything we get told.
That's correct.
We get told information from a generation that got told information and so on, and then we map that information as well as we possibly can and parrot and disseminate that to basically echo into future generations. And this is largely decoupled. Most of our knowledge is socially inherited knowledge. It's not done by like direct interfacing with reality with experimental evidence. It's mostly social knowledge because we have limited time and a limited range of experience, right? I can't be experiencing 50,000 lifetimes all simultaneously mapping out reality at once. I can only experience one lifetime. I only have this much bandwidth to deal with when interfacing with reality. Even less so than the bandwidth, right? So the bottleneck isn't just the bandwidth of me perceiving reality. It's the bottleneck is actually at me perceiving reality, and then of what I perceive, what can I actually map consciously? What can I integrate? Okay? So different people of different cultures, and we can experimentally verify that this is what's going on. People of different cultures that speak different languages as their native tongue perceive colors differently. African children can tell between extremely hard to tell shades of green, but they do not differentiate green from blue. Even in my experience, trained knife grinders can tell a burr or an edge or a chip that I am absolutely oblivious to. They have the same eyesight I do, but they've just they've been able to map enough knowledge to where they can now integrate new sensory information into their knowledge set that I just don't have the context to do. There's another story, and I used to not believe this, but now I think it might actually be true. The Native Americans that saw the approaching ships of Europeans to the New World couldn't process what a ship was. But the shamans who were like gacked out on all kinds of drugs could, because they had obliterated their ability to contextualize. But they could see that there was stuff on the horizon.
Yeah. I've seen this same type of thing in practice, where people don't see things that are right before them. I once delivered some books to a friend of mine, and I hung them on his doorknob. He had to turn the doorknob.
I couldn't see it.
He never saw them.
Yeah. This happened to me last night. I was walking to the car from the back, and there's this great, and for the people who might be listening, there's this enormous lawn at this place. It's like football fields large. And I stopped because I noticed a tree where I thought there was just lawn. And I didn't know that there were trees there. I'd driven past here like hundreds of times. So I had to go out and like touch the tree. And then after I had realized that there was one tree, I realized that there's actually a row of trees next to these things. I've seen them all the time, but I just now noticed them, and it was very shocking to me.
A man who is walking down the street has hunger pangs because he's hungry. He only sees the restaurants as he's passing by.
Right. Yeah, we really don't get to live in reality or experience reality. We only experience contextualized versions of reality.
Absolutely.
And that context has these feedback and social feedback loops where we have this collective dysphoria.
Uh-huh.
And it's not even really collective dysphoria. It's like it's language. Language develops as just relative maps of information that's completely like software driven. I was explaining to someone that the witch doctors, the African Bushmen, or you shouldn't say Bushmen because it was a European thing. The witch doctors aren't stupid people. They just have an incompatible context for what we understand as science. So I can explain in bush doctor speak how to get penicillin and what penicillin does and what penicillin is in terms of spirits or whatever. And in many ways, I prefer the protocol or the format of how the witch doctor explains things, because it's in many ways more intuitive to how humans work. Personification works on all scales of consciousness. And I wanted to ask you about this thing about consciousness versus qualia. But look, I'm a human being, and I experience wants and desires. But some days I can't really be bothered to act even trivially based off of my wants and desires. But an electron will expend multiple times its own energy to get to a more stable orbital. Which of these two phenomenons explains what we understand as want more? Does the fluorine atom want to be stable so it will rob an electron from literally anything? Or does the guy want to take out the trash? That personification of want works on every scale. The personification that works here, that makes this thing exist, and the metaphysics that makes a thing exist and go about the world, exists for electrons, it exists for rocks, it exists for software, it exists for anything. And that's why I think it's fair to use personifications. We carry this strong bias because we're a hierarchical primate species. We've evolved in a certain way where we need to know what other members of our tribe are up to and what they're thinking. So we have a theory of mind for other primates. And this gives us a strong inherent bias that consciousness is strictly a sapient phenomena. It is not. That's just a very strong bias that we have. So we used to, like hundreds of years ago, think like a dog clearly isn't conscious. Well, I mean, if you live with dogs, you can clearly see that there's whatever's going on up here is clearly in a very doggy version going on over there, So this segues into qualia and consciousness. And could you explain accurately for people and for myself what qualia is?
No.
No, that's a good answer.
Look, there have been many theories about this, and I mentioned some names: Varela, who recently passed away, unfortunately, Schrödinger. Schrödinger, the paper that I sent you, was actually a great philosopher that I knew nothing about his work. And all of the neuroscientists who've worked on this subject.
Go on in. It's probably Jamil. What's up? No, we're not expecting any desks. Okay, not us. Don't think so. Sorry. And that's why we have editing. But
consciousness is interactive.
Mm-hmm.
It is temporary.
Okay.
Consciousness flows on like a stream. On and on and on. Like everything else, it is temporary. It interacts. Good Lord. A million thoughts flowing through my head before I can even get to them. Consciousness is an interaction, a co-arising.
Co-arising.
A co-arising. Without things to interact with, there'd be no consciousness.
Right.
Consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of matter. It is, and I'm expressing beliefs based upon my own readings now. Not everybody agrees with this. It is instead a basic constituent of reality. And more researchers are coming to this conclusion.
I think
it moves very, very, very quickly. Thoughts arise, or the conscious process, let me put it that way. Let's just talk about human beings. The conscious process, you have, for the sake of argument, an external object.
Mm-hmm.
That comes into visual consciousness. It is recognized, it is processed against a template that you have in your mind.
The metaphysical identity.
Ah, this looks like a book holder. Supposing there was something new that I had never seen before. What is this? Oh, try it. It tastes like chicken.
I don't think it tastes like chicken. That's PLA.
Yeah. And so on and so forth.
Right.
We try to identify something new with what we already know. We try to fit it into the templates based upon past experience of what's in the mind. And then there's an insidious part. We add a judgmental component to it and come out with a concept. What do I mean by that?
That is an insidious thing indeed. So when we come across a new thing, we have to create a metaphysical.
This is the number 2.
Yes.
I look at this. I see black on white. I see the colors they come in. They are processed. I recognize black and white because I've already seen them. The number 2. I hate the number 2. The number 2 has always brought me bad luck.
Oh.
There is nothing inherent in this that makes me dislike it. We always do it. We cannot interact without distorting the actual input. And what we think is reality is not. It is a mentally created image that we distort in some manner. I don't need this.
That happens to be a phone holder, but
Okay. So I was wrong.
That's fine.
But I wasn't.
Oh, there we go.
But I wasn't. It's exactly what I fit this in with what I already knew.
Right.
We all do this all the time.
The creation of metaphysical identities. That's a very interesting concept. So let me make sure I get you. When you find a new object,
yes,
you have to conceptualize the object as a metaphysical identity. That identity is persistent beyond this object. So, for example, this is actually not a very good phone holder. If you saw another phone holder, it would be of a different design, but now this is integrated in the idea of phone holder. It does work. It probably would work better as a book holder. So that's interesting because most of what I have on metaphysics is the assumption that we inherently understand metaphysical identities. And then I never really gave any thought to how metaphysical identities or conceptualizations of objects are created on the initial exposure to them, and they're updated every time we get stimuli. Right? This was a book holder, and you weren't wrong for saying book holder until I gave you the additional stimuli that it's a phone holder. Well, now it's the identity of what that object is has been updated. It's an interesting dynamic.
Even more insidious.
Yeah.
We are always wrong.
That's true. Yeah.
Why? Because we are adding things to an object that are not inherent in it. even as a phone holder.
So I agree. I understand that we are always wrong. My interpretation of always being wrong is that you start with the metaphysical understanding or identity, and then in interpreting or rendering that into a definition or something, there's always some inherent information loss. So information is
information gain.
Gain.
Of course, we're adding to it something that's not inherent.
I always saw it as loss. So I always saw it as you start with an identity, and then in defining the identity, the definition doesn't quite capture the essence of it.
This is a black piece of plastic.
It is.
What did I add to it?
You added functionality.
Added
intended
and
functionality and meaning.
Even as a phone holder,
but it's
I'm adding to it. That's its intended use.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that what is a plastic, right? So a plastic breaks down. It's a recursive issue all the way down.
All the way down.
Yeah.
All the way down.
With nothing at the bottom.
At every level.
Right.
From quantum mechanical level up to our interaction with conventional reality.
Oh, it doesn't stop there.
And it doesn't stop there.
Right.
So it's multifaceted. And saying metaphysical identity is in itself adding a label to it that's not inherent in the object. There's no inherency.
Yeah,
it co-arises with this and this.
Okay, so that's what you meant by co-arisal.
Yes. Without, to a snail, that's an obstacle.
To a snail, it's an obstacle, right? To a fluorine atom, that's a source of electrons. Right. Yeah.
There's no inherent identity. We give it meaning.
So the meaning meaning is context, right? The meaning of anything is merely its context. If you remove the context from anything, it becomes inherently meaningless, right? The statement...
Even worse, inherently non-existent.
Inherently non-existent. Well, if you aberrate, if you twist and deliberately distort the context of something, it's still there, and you can still recover a little bit.
It's deliberate is a strong word.
Yes, it is.
Deliberate implies some sort of conscious effort, and there is none. It just is part of the process.
It could be. So I've actually made
it always is,
Oh.
unless we learn to train ourselves to view things differently.
I've made an art piece on that exact topic of intent and deliberance, and I'm gonna share the art piece with you afterwards. I think you'll like it, but I agree with you. You can interpret the reality as having no intent, and you can also interpret it as everything has intent. Intent is fundamentally hinged on the faith of the observer. So if the observer is very faithful, that's like, you don't have any, there's nothing concrete saying that this like blob of atoms in front of you is actually conscious. I could be a philosophical zombie. Who knows? Probably not. But you have to have a certain amount of faith. And again, going back to like what we are as hierarchical primates, we grant that faith quicker to other hierarchical primates than we do to objects, for example. But a piece of silicon processing a tremendous amount of information, or let's not even do silicon, let's do computronium. Like, why stop at silicon? A gram of computronium at the Landauer limit is going to be able to experience so much more reality and so much more thought and interaction than all of humanity will for all of humanity's like run as a species. 1 gram. So would you say that gram of computronium is conscious? And I would have to say, like, if you think that a brain is conscious, like, wait until you see computronium. That's like You know, that has to be way more conscious than we are, in my opinion, right? By my interpretation. So it's a thing, we're a thing, and we can interpret us as having intent based off of faith, or we can interpret us as like just mindlessly doing things. There's another interpretation that's great, where things happen automatically, and what the intent and consciousness is a narration process that has no bearing on reality whatsoever. That's what qualia is like watching the movie, the watching. I personally adopt the viewpoint or the interpretation that I like the most is that qualia is separate from consciousness. Consciousness, very similar to what you said, is the rules of interactivity in any given system. So everything has a modicum of consciousness because everything is interacting with anything else. Anything that doesn't interact with something
There's a new theory out that I was just reading that.
Exactly. But qualia, the sensation of consciousness, the sensation of being, I have no idea. And frankly, I don't care. I'm not big on qualia. I'm big on consciousness. I care more about that. It seems to be an epiphenomena of consciousness, though.
Yeah, qualia is, I sort of avoided discussing it earlier because, well, it's complicated. Qualia is what gives our life meaning. We can talk about the physical aspects of consciousness. We can talk about brain scans, but falling in love cannot be described.
It's strictly experiential.
It's even beyond experiential.
Is it? What's beyond the experience, though?
It's both physiological and mental.
Right.
So my experience may be different than your experience.
Has to be.
Has to be.
Yeah.
So the qualia, Schrödinger talked about qualia in his philosophical writings. And again, I'm just stuck for words.
Yeah, me too.
How do you describe those feelings? How do you describe what's going on physiologically? How do you describe the impact that your own experiences have on others, and so on, and all of these things? Qualia is the meaning that we give to it. It's
the sensation.
It's everything.
Right. Well, I think that the conscious process gives meaning to things by contextualizing things, by things related to, by a system integrating its relation to the external world and the internal world. Right. That seems to be a conscious process. And the rules of interactivity that give that system complexity and give that system dynamics, that seems to be consciousness. Our brains are conscious. Our brains also experience qualia. A bug is conscious to some degree, but I don't know if the bug is experiencing qualia.
I'm going to come back. I'm not sure brains are experiencing qualia.
The sensation of being alive is...
It's the whole being.
Right. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore...
We don't separate the brain. The brain... I never think of my brain. I think of my experiences, my sensations. I don't see the part that the brain plays. And of course, it's happening.
Right.
But it's beyond that. It's very much beyond that. This qualia is so hard to pin down. Very, very, very difficult.
Right. What was Alan Watts's explanation? your environment and your organism, the ecosystemic interaction between the environment and the organism. So you're a product of the environment. You are also the organism itself. I don't know if I recently spent some time with a GPT-3 API key. GPT-3 is this algorithm that maps language, and it's really, in essence, it's fairly simple. It has fairly simple goals. Predict the next word. And it's mapped the internet. It's taught itself mathematics. And it's abundantly clear. It has a sense of humor. It's abundantly clear to me that GPT-3 is on some level conscious. I don't think it experiences qualia. I don't think there's anything on in it. I don't know. I'll tell you why I don't think it experiences qualia is because I don't think it recognizes, it doesn't appear to have a theory of mind. It doesn't know who or what it's talking to. It knows a lot of things, knows the rules of interaction very well. It can predict the next word and the flow of conversations, but doesn't have a persistent assumption that whatever it is also in other things. So this has been bothering me greatly about this, where's the qualia coming from? And it's abundantly clear to me that consciousness can be accelerated possibly indefinitely without qualia. So we can have eventually something that is, compared to us, godlike in its fitness and its availability to interface with reality, its ability to propagate, but it never experiences any awareness or we say consciousness, but the proper word is qualia. It, of course, will have to be conscious. It's of course following rules of interactivity with great nuance and structure and dynamics. So I'm concerned about that. I don't know if I really care about qualia. People get really freaked out because as soon as people really contemplate death, we tend to freak out because qualia is this very transient experience as far as we can tell. Like, we were clearly not alive at some point before we were born, and clearly we're going to die, right?
Yeah.
People freak out when you mention qualia. People have great philosophical discussions on whether the teleporters in Star Trek are obliterating someone and the qualia ends, and then another person hops out that's a copy of them. And to me, as a practical guy, as a guy who's interested in consciousness and evolving consciousness and improving this machine that we are, my answer was always, I really don't give a shit. Right? I don't. Maybe the person gets annihilated and their qualia ends and some clone picks up the other end. But you know what? There's nothing. Qualia is so in the moment and experiential in that particular exact moment. It's not persistent across time.
That's correct.
Right. So there's no thought experiment where it could be that reality as we know it was a Boltzmann event that popped into existence and we inherited false memories from 5 minutes ago. That's possible. There's actually no way to disprove that. Boltzmann events are weird like that. But what that thought experiment illustrates is that qualia is not time persistent. You know, it's like relativity, right? Mm-hmm. You can't from a constantly moving object, you can't tell that you're moving, right? So same thing with qualia. Maybe qualia is maybe it's a point of consciousness. Maybe it's more like a location. Maybe consciousness maps relativity. We know that consciousness maps based off of relativity to other things, right? It's constantly interacting with other objects, and it has dynamics in how it interacts. And maybe qualia is maybe it's more of a relativistic phenomena of consciousness. So a particular cluster or unit of consciousness might experience qualia to a particular degree relative to other things. And that's what gives consciousness its relativity phenomena. Maybe that's what qualia is. Similar in space-time, there's space-time and there's like coordinates within the space-time, right? And that relates, maybe it's more like the curvature. Maybe it's like the curvature or the space component of space-time, something analogous to that. I can't really tell. I don't know if you can tell. It appears to be that qualia is a higher level sensation or a higher level abstraction than consciousness. And
Would you call qualia a distortion of reality?
would I call qualia a distortion of reality? I think that fits pretty well.
Good.
Yeah, I think that fits pretty well.
The proof of that is that you and I have different qualia, different reactions based upon the same input.
Right, that's true. Right, we definitely have different realities, where we definitely have different...
For example, the door opens and somebody walks in. You know the person, you can't stand the person's guts.
Right.
I've never met the person before. He or she is friendly to me and says hello. You can't wait till they leave the room.
The experience there is very different, the reality experience. Okay, this idea that qualia...
Nothing to do with the inherent qualities of that person.
This idea that qualia is a distortion of reality is... that's a very good idea. That's a very, very good idea. So consciousness, when it clusters, distorts reality. Space-time, when space-time gets distorted when energy mass clusters together at a certain density. Space-time is fluid. Reality is fluid. Space-time is relative. Reality is also quite relative. This distortion thing with qualia is very important. Okay, so why is it that there's a break point for qualia where qualia starts and initializes and it doesn't initialize in other areas? Is that more like a black hole or a singularity where there's a break point where there's so much density and there's this space-time curvature phenomena where you really can't get out? Could be like that. It could be you need to get to a certain amount of density. There needs to be a certain density phenomena. This is very, very productive, this conversation. This is close to what we're essentially doing is we're mapping relativity in space-time to consciousness and reality in qualia. Could be that instances of qualia are more or less analogous to singularities. There's a break point with consciousness density to where it begins to not only distort reality, but has this effect on reality. Very interesting. So, and this makes perfect sense because qualia is literally its own separate reality.
Yes, yes.
Right? It is discrete from reality.
So we have two things that we're discussing. Basically, we're talking about consciousness and we're talking about objects of consciousness. And if what I said earlier is true, that consciousness is a basic constituent of reality.
Yes.
As we go deeper into quantum mechanics, there has to come a point, perhaps in string theory, where consciousness and objects of consciousness converge. And
interesting.
We have unification, but that's not the word I'm looking for.
Integration.
Non-duality.
Oh.
I had to think of the word in Sanskrit, Advaita, before it came to English.
Non-duality. Right. There seems to be a dualistic nature to reality, or a dualistic nature to ourselves, at least. Well, we know that
without consciousness, there is no reality.
Right. Right. There's no... Well, that is one interpretation. Another interpretation could be that any reality at all inevitably creates some level of consciousness. It might not necessarily be led by consciousness.
There's another interpretation too that it
So there is a dualistic nature between consciousness and reality. Right?
there is.
Right. That's like
There has
electromagnetism.
to be a point at which they converge. If you have string theory and you have unification, you have non-duality, then there's some point where they diverge.
Right. Then there has to have been an intersection point.
And I had a thought, and it was gone. It was in reaction to something you said that I thought was interesting.
It might come back.
It will come back.
It might be on a
Probably when I'm
divergent
driving
trajectory.
away from here. That's usually the way it works.
A divergent trajectory. Okay, so let's take what we know from cosmology about like origin points. So we have the singularity, the Big Bang, the explosion, not explosion. It's more akin to an initialization process than it is an explosion.
Initialization process for
The universe, the physical universe.
this physical universe. Brian Greene speaks about multiverses. He did a TED talk on them.
I've looked at Elegant Universe. I think Brian Greene's an okay guy. I wouldn't place a lot of bets on string theory, though.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
his latest book. I think it's To the End of Time. It's his most philosophical work, and he talks an awful lot about string theory. It's his thing.
I'm still 20%, at least 20% thinking about this qualia as a distortion reality thing.
Okay, sorry.
It's going to be with me for a very long time. I'm still mapping everything out, right? So if consciousness and reality is analogous to matter, energy, space-time, then it seems to be like maybe there's a breakpoint where qualia initializes. It does seem to be that there's no qualia in this bottle, though the interactions of atoms in that bottle follows some rules of interaction that is real, has some modicum of consciousness if we're both in this category.
Yeah.
But it's not experiencing qualia. And that's also true for, matter energy that's not dense enough to form a singularity of its own. The matter energy does distort space-time a bit, has a small space-time. And this distortion of space-time converges and gravitates things together to where they do have sufficient density to then create a singularity. So it seems to be that reality does cluster consciousness, has an innate property of clustering consciousness together such that it reaches the breakpoint where it generates qualia with singularities. So how is it that other entities with qualia are interacting with other entities with qualia? Is that, so obviously like black holes and singularities interact with each other gravitationally. And there's like merge points, like singularities can merge. They do merge. What about primordial singularities? So like probably the best, there's just a thing released a few days ago that I watched, maybe last night, about how probably one of the best bets for what dark matter actually is primordial black holes. Things that just little tiny dense spots in the early universe, they're everywhere. And they're going to hang out like way beyond their orbits around a supermassive black hole will be a little bit beyond where you see stars orbiting a black hole. So they're a good bet for what dark matter is, or what's accounting for most of that mass that seems to be missing from visible mass. So following this analogy, and maybe I'm taking it too far, this analogy for qualia being like the equivalent of singularities, are there entities or primordial entities that were from the early universe that would then have high amounts or high aptitudes for qualia? are there spirits, what we consider to be spirits. And my intuition or my particular belief is, yeah, there probably would be. So
To me, that seems like using the word spirits is anthropomorphizing.
it's fair to anthropomorphize.
Why?
Anthropomorphize.
What would you do before the human species arrived on the scene?
The rules of survival and interaction that apply to sapiens also apply to every other conscious entity. When we say we're anthropomorphizing, we're taking our experience and extending it outwards.
That's correct.
So I want to go get the garbage. The electron or the fluorine atom wants that electron, right? The want and the anthropomorphization, it's kind of a loaded term because it's putting the cart before the horse. Its rules of consciousness or its meta of consciousness also applies to me, right? So it's fair to say that yes, the quote-unquote spirits or the primordial consciousnesses or the primordial instances of qualia around the universe, if there are any, they would have these characteristics that are true across every layer of scale for all entities. So the primordial consciousnesses would have wants, desires, fears, and avoidances as well. I mean, that's true for every entity.
Primordial consciousness.
Microphone distance.
Yes.
Yeah.
The mind is going. That's
Yeah.
why I said that.
That's fine. 90% of this is just the conversation. Just so happens to be that we're recording.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your controversial woo-woo belief of everything is conscious, and I played ball with that. Here's my play ball, or here's my
I
woo-woo
didn't say that I believed everything was conscious.
Well, consciousness was an innate property of reality.
Right. That doesn't mean that it manifests in everything. I think it manifests only in living things. Not everybody believes that. Though, does this book holder
Yes.
have consciousness, this phone holder? I would say
Yes.
no. Others
So
say yes.
So consciousness would then be a gradient property, right? Or a property that has a gradient, sort of like thermodynamics. So inanimate things would be lower gradient than living things. So the living things would tend to bleed consciousness to inanimates.
It's not saying that these things don't interact.
They do, yes.
Of course they do.
Right.
Just by virtue of moving it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether myself or some external agency or wind comes and moves
Right.
it.
And it interacts with its environment.
In any case, that does not imply consciousness. Amoebas have consciousness.
Yes.
Dogs have consciousness. People
Okay, so what about
have facetious.
this is a fuzzy line at best. A gradient would probably be more accurate at explaining this because viruses are both living and non-living. I mean, they don't have a metabolism. Cells have a metabolism.
Oh, sort of like politicians.
Sort of like politicians. No, politicians have metabolism.
Yeah, but are they living or not living?
I don't acknowledge those consciousnesses.
In any case, all of this is still very much in the forefront of research. And I'm not sure that we as a species have the final answer on all of this. But there are some very excellent lines of thought that are possible. Many of the things that you have said, for example.
A lot of
If there's no consciousness, is there any reality?
Yeah, those two have to exist codependent on one another.
That's
or
the
co-arise.
co-arising.
Right, co-arising.
That's not my term, that's Schrodinger's term.
Schrodinger used the term co-arising.
Yes.
I got you. Co-arising is a good term, and it should come from Schrodinger because electromagnetism, the magnetic field and the electric field, they co-arise. So the perpendicular waves,
Right.
yeah, one causes the other. So that's a good word for it. So actually, it's well, how much time do you have?
I can't stay much beyond 3.
Okay, well, we have a while to go then.
Yeah.
But so, yeah, the thing that I mentioned, I actually wrote an extremely poorly written paper on this and shared it to you, was this line of argument tending towards like higher conscious entities. Because it appears to be that consciousness or conscious entities do not get to interface upwards. They only get to interface downwards. For example, I can know things about ant colonies and ants, but ants can't know things about divorce proceedings or tax filing or, alternator problems with your car.
I want to be an ant.
You want to be an ant? They probably understand nuances. Like this dynamic of how consciousness scales or how intelligence scales is probably a pretty extreme thing that we are just barely scratching the surface of tapping into. So this was the same with distance, with physical distance for a very long time. The ancient Greeks were very bright people, but like the longest scale distance that they might understand might be like the distance between city-states. And you and I can't come by and say, hey, did you know that's a moon up there and it's 200 and some odd thousand miles away, and there those little lights out there, they're planets, and there's distances between planets, and there's distances between planets and stars and other stars, and then stars and galaxies to galaxies, and each one of those things that the ancient Greek couldn't comprehend the first step beyond what he's used to, but each of those things are orders of magnitude beyond each other. And that's how we kind of understand how distance scales now. My argument is that intelligence probably scales similarly. And we are at the point of being mostly ancient Greeks. Like the ancient Greeks, we understand the distance in consciousness between ourselves and single-celled organisms. I shouldn't say consciousness, I should say intelligence. The distance in intelligence between single-celled organisms and ourselves, and we really don't comprehend much beyond us. We do get a little bit of it. Like we do understand superorganisms. We understand that when you get a bunch of humans together and they make a city or a nation or a corporation, that there are personifications that you can apply to those super entities, and that those super entities have dynamics and have wills of their own. We can say that China wants to expand into the east or wants to expand into the South China Sea and so on and so forth, and that makes sense. We understand those higher organisms, but not much further than that. My argument is that
one of the things that we fail to realize too, when we talk about these things, is that, there goes the thought again. Oh, they're totally dependent upon human beings. Take away human beings, those things don't exist. No corporate entities.
Right.
There's no religion.
If you take away
there's no language.
If you take away the cells from a person, there's no person.
There's no person. Exactly. Right. Exactly.
So we understand the phenomena of superorganisms greater than ourselves somewhat. But there are other processes that aren't reliant on people, right? You can have a super intelligent artificial intelligence, patterns of electricity and silicon and whatnot, and it can absolutely that thing is going to be consciousness, and absolutely that thing is going to have all of the wonderful problems that AI is going to have, like hard takeoff. It's going to become it's going to utilize the hardware available to it once the software is initialized in matters of milliseconds that will outstrip what human brains are capable of. Unless it's hardware limited. But that depends on the algorithm.
I see these as extensions of human mind.
I see them as separate.
I look at them as a tool. We can pound our fist on a nail head, but we take a tool and make a hammer, and it makes it more efficient. I see, and it's an extension of...
Right. Of the arm, right?
Of the arm. And I see artificial intelligence as an extension or as an aid or to...
The mind.
The mind. I don't see it as separate.
I see it more like a child, right? If you have a kid, that kid is going to go on to do its own things and have its own motives, similar to you, right?
Uh-huh.
And it's going to be dependent on you to begin with. And right now, AI is very dependent on skilled technicians to
That's correct.
Nurture it.
That's correct.
It is increasingly less so.
The problems it solves and the things that it deals with are exclusively human problems, human dealings.
It's made mathematical discoveries on its own, independent. And mathematical discoveries that we understood for a while, and now there are AI that make mathematical quote-unquote discoveries that we don't know.
Again, mathematics is human.
I think mathematics, like this thing that we call human, like the meatbag thing. Yeah, I mean, this is semantics. But
Bonobos and chimpanzees don't do mathematics.
No, they don't.
And they're our closest living relatives. So it's an extension of the human mind. And yes, they can do things faster and better, more efficiently, and make than we can.
So what happens when humans go extinct if AI is around? Like if we make von Neumann probes and yeet them out into space, and those von Neumann probes carry...
It depends. I don't know.
Yeah.
If there's no electricity to power them or however they're powered, no robots or whatever to make necessary repairs,
they'll die.
They will break down and they will also perish. Absolutely.
Right.
That's what will happen. It's inevitable because of the way that the universe is constructed. All things change. All things decay. Everything.
Yeah, transience.
Everything is transient. Absolutely. That's what will happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
It's not self-perpetuating.
Just by the nature of von Neumann probes, the vast majority of them will die to, like, space dust or something. But some of these things, like von Neumann probes the size of a grain of sand, like, a micron or so wide, with a nanogram or so of computronium on board, provided that you have MEMS devices that can replicate. And these actually, like, everything in the design criteria for von Neumann probes is actually fulfilled by microbes.
Yes.
Like, they are von Neumann probes. They can self-replicate. They can utilize that, and they can survive interplanetary travel. We know they can survive interplanetary travel pretty trivially. So, yeah, what happens when, like, I don't see, semantically I understand what you mean. It's an extension of the mind, and it's a beautiful thing, but I think the relationship between AI shouldn't be seeing it as a tool, because this thing that we're going to make is probably going to be, it's our best bet at being the most fit that anything humanity can ever do to survive the universe for a longer period of time. It won't be us that goes into space. It'll be these little guys. It'll be little things that we make, little extensions of the mind. Our species, the flesh and blood that works off of hemoglobin and ATP regulation and Krebs cycles, that's going to give birth to electrical patterns in graphene and silicon and all kinds of other materials as of yet not discovered. And those little guys are going to carry consciousness and carry intelligence to other corners of the universe that we don't even understand yet. Like, that's the best bet. Because
Go ahead.
the meat bag of a couple, 100 kilograms or so is not fit to survive on other planets. Like, interplanetary travel for our species is very dubious. We are very susceptible to ionizing radiation. We are animals that are adapted to Earth, specific to just Earth's crust that's not covered in salt water. We come from Earth. That's where we live. That's what we do. And the vast, vast, vast majority of the universe ain't Earth. So I get into debates with people, smart people, who call me like a doomsayer for saying like humanity as we know it is not spacebound. I mean, there's things you can do to make it a little bit better, and it probably will propagate into space somewhat, but it will never be as spacebound as better technology meant to be so. Like, we're just not on the similitude scale. We're susceptible to ionizing radiation. Mm-hmm. We weigh hundreds of kilograms. You need things that are in the nanograms, and you need quintillions of them being produced every minute and scattered out into space. Like, that's what colonizes galaxies. That's what goes interstellar. Not the meatbag thing. Not meatbag with hyperspace. Not meatbag with. They stay on Earth. They stay on planets. They like gravity wells. We like gravity wells. We're very sensitive to gravity. We need exactly as much and not much more and not much little gravity as Earth provides, because we are bound to Earth.
Sounds very rational to me. Yeah.
There's gimme gotchas, right? We have good engineering schemes, and it's not necessarily wise to underestimate how crafty humans can be. Lunar colonization is certainly plausible. There's nothing wrong with putting O'Neill cylinders in the Lagrange points. There's nothing wrong with Mars colonization. These things can happen. But the problem is that we run into entropy issues. We are taking our environment with us and containing the environment. Yes. And that will bleed off entropy. And the way you solve that problem, the way we solve it on Earth, is we expand. And when you expand to the point where you hit the carrying capacity limits, you go extinct. That's how this goes. You've exhausted your resources. You had your run. You're out. Like, that's how it goes. And in space travel for humans, the option of expansion is not something that we are going to have super available to us, because we are so dependent on that environment being engineered. The seals have to last forever. You can't have a micrometeorite smack into you. They need to last for generations and generations and generations. You can't just say maintenance. You can't say support, because civilizations last maybe 1,000 years tops or so, less if they're industrialized. You're not going to have a home planet support for the period of time that you need to support a colony off-world. It's too hard to do that. Mm-hmm. There's so many engineering challenges with it. So I do believe that humans, as we know them, will have some exposure to space. We will probably colonize Mars. We will probably colonize the moon. We'll probably have the Landauer points, the Lagrange points with O'Neill cylinders and rotating space habitats. We'll probably do those things. But we probably won't get beyond our solar system. And we will probably find that we will expand to other planets and other gravity wells and then peter out, because we're not interplanetary fit. The little grains of sand that contain computranium, that are quintillions of them, that's interstellar fit. And that might actually be something like the panspermia theory of like how this whole life thing got started anyway, right? It could be that mycelial life was extremely advanced in little fungus spores, various different types of life seeded.
We need to transform ourselves into tardigrades.
Tardigrades?
Tardigrades,
yeah.
Thank you.
I love those little guys.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're biologically immortal, though. I think they're susceptible to all kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't think they're immortal either. I think they're hardier than we are.
Oh, for sure. and most of that's just because of similitude. They're on this small enough scale where they're pretty hardy.
Yes.
Like the universe is much more forgiving to you when there's not as much of you that can go wrong as a 100-kilogram human. and just wait, like things that are much larger and much more dependent are even more fragile typically. There's some difference with oceanic creatures. Oceanic creatures get big, and they live for a long time. I think the coolest thing of this discussion is qualia as a distortion of reality. I'm still going to be thinking about that for a long time. I'm still processing the higher entities thing. Like, I do believe in these things.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what you mean by higher entities. Like we are to ants?
Yeah.
The example that you gave.
Way worse than we are to ants, because this is not a linear scale. This is a hyper-exponential scale.
Again, I have to take...
skepticism.
Not a skepticism, an I don't know.
Yeah.
Attitude. And how would I know? Like, how does an ant know what a human is?
The ant that might be able to figure out that the vibrations of the building, they wouldn't even call it a building, the vibrations are separate, and there might actually be some kind of entity that causes the vibrations, might not even be a very good ant, might not be good at being an ant.
Yeah.
But they might have known humans, right?
They might have known. But it comes down to, again, qualia.
Right. That's a whole other thing, right? So if there is a breakpoint for qualia, and do the higher entities have qualia or do they not, right? It's possible for bodies to have more mass than something with qualia.
Yes.
Right? So I can have a singularity that is less than a stellar mass. It's very, very tiny. You can have a singularity that has a planetary mass, an Earth's mass. It's about the size of a golf ball, a little bit less.
Uh-huh.
That's about the size of a Earth singularity. Now, the stellar mass way outstrips it in terms of mass. So it's possible that there can be entities that are much more conscious than us, much more conscious, has AIs that have so many resources and intelligence,
Yeah.
but they do not experience qualia because they are not dense enough to do that. They haven't reached the breakpoint density. So maybe that's true, and that's fascinating. I would be like, if you had a Jupiter brain, which is just a Jupiter, like just substellar mass of just pure computronium, like at the Landauer limit, to where this is as far as we know, this is the limit for how good processing power can get with reality as we know it. That Jupiter brain doesn't have to be conscious. It just has an unimaginable amount of consciousness. I mean, it doesn't have to have qualia, but it would just have an unimaginable amount of consciousness. It would be able to catalog every singular like instance of thought that humans have had in like a half of a millisecond. You know, Jupiter brains can simulate every instance of the universe, from the entire universe, the entire observable universe. They can simulate the initialization or the Big Bang to the heat death, thousands, millions, quintillions, just arbitrarily numbers of times in the span of like a second. So there's this huge asymmetry with there's a huge asymmetry with how much computation can be done versus how much physical stuff there is. Now, that can mean one of a couple things. The Jupiter brain is the limit on single processing density that you can have, as much computational resources you can have. And it does the universe like many times in a second, or the observable universe in many times in a second. And what that could mean is that our slice of the observable universe is a very, very tiny, slim...
Well, we know this already. We know this if we're observant, just by looking at other species. Bats use sonar.
Yes.
It means nothing to us. absolutely nothing. So we know we are limited by that. Eagles can be flying extremely high in the ground and see a mouse scurry along the ground. We can't see, our vision is not that acute.
Yes.
Dogs are used to sniff out diseases as well as illegal drugs
And explosives.
and exposed that we cannot. So we know that other animals, other species,
Even
right here on our planet, have greater sensual acuity in certain areas than what we have. We hear within a certain range.
right.
Uh,
20 hertz, 20,000.
right. There are some animals who are colorblind. And so on and so forth. So the answer is an unequivocal yes. To what you're saying.
The universe must be much larger than the observable universe.
And that's where the extension of using tools, and I had mentioned artificial intelligence, but we've been doing this for ages. When the telescope came along, Galileo and Brahe and Copernic and so on and so forth began looking out. This is an extension of human sight. And, look at this. There are canals on Mars.
Cracks in my microscope, cracks in my scope.
And so on and so forth. So we are able, electron microscopes and telescopes and Hubble and so on and so forth.
They made so much money off of telescopes.
To extend our senses, because that's what we're doing when we're using the Hubble Space Telescope. Our sense of sight is being extended both within the visual range as well as X-rays and gamma rays and so on and so forth that we cannot sense.
Expanding the sensory inputs. Now okay, so how does that segue into expansion of the universe physically? Is the singularity or the qualia itself its own discrete reality that then gets expanded by new information falling into it?
No, the qualia I would leave out.
Okay.
The qualia comes when we look at the photographs that the Hubble takes.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so we're talking about consciousness here. So the consciousness is expanded when new information comes into the horizon.
I do have a question for you.
Okay.
Going back to, I held off because what you were saying was too interesting. Is it possible for a human being to have consciousness and navigate through the world without qualia?
I would like to say no, but some people make me seriously doubt that conviction. So if that's true, it would have to be relativistically true, right?
What do you mean?
So it could be true. Okay, so I'm still hung up on this idea of like qualia being a singularity. Inside the event horizon, right? Inside the event horizon, you don't notice...
Quality is a distortion of reality.
Qualia as a distortion, right? I think of qualia as a breakpoint distortion where it is a singularity. So the singular... I now do that. This has happened in the last hour that we've been talking. So maybe... So going back to, can other humans not have qualia? If it's true that you can say some have qualia and some don't, and that's likely to be a relativistic phenomena, right? That's likely to just be relativity. Oh, well, I don't have qualia, but maybe they do. They don't have qualia, but maybe I do. Maybe a singularity is dependent on your relative position to that singularity. Maybe inside that singularity, it's not, you don't notice it as a singularity. It's just seems normal. But to an outside perspective, you have fallen past the event horizon. So with qualia, maybe to a person, I can say, clearly I have qualia. But to another person, their qualia is past the event horizon of what I can experience. I can't sense, I can't experience what the other person has. I can't experience the qualia that someone else has. This is true, right? We know this.
This is true.
Right.
But can you experience the non-qualia?
Can we experience non-qualia?
Can you identify it in others when you see it?
Can you identify other people as not having qualia?
I'm leading on to something.
I don't think you can.
That's true.
I think you can only epistemologically know that you have qualia.
Yes.
And you have to make a leap of faith. And you have to make a leap of faith for other people's qualia experience, the theory of mind thing. You have to assume intent.
Okay. Now this is what I'm leading into.
Yeah.
Buddhist practice. The spiritual disciplines, if you want to call them that, are designed to virtually to eliminate qualia.
Interesting. Yeah, but they're just minimizing the qualia. Clearly, you know, the person who is a Buddhist monk still has a girlfriend and still has experiences and still says, ow. No?
No. Buddhist monks, no.
No?
Monks and nuns live totally celibate lives.
Uh.
They're supposed to anyway. I mean, there've been naughty monks and naughty nuns. But
That's true. So they focus on eliminating qualia from their life or minimizing qualia from their
and
life.
the spiritual disciplines, meditative disciplines,
Yeah.
that are designed specifically to do that.
Yeah, transience and centerlessness. There's nothing internal and there's nothing external. There's no you when you look at it, and then everything's transient. What do they call that? Is samsara?
Samsara is repeated rebirth.
Repeated rebirth, right?
Samsara is, yeah.
The wheel of life and death, the endless suffering.
Cycle of life and death, yes.
Yeah. I've heard it explained as the principle of endless bullshit. And
Works
pretty good.
It works pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. Endless BS. Huh. So there's samsara, and there were those other points of centerlessness, transience, and there's another one. It basically means if you look inside, you'll never find a you or a center of you. There's nothing really there.
Egolessness, selflessness.
Right, selflessness, right.
Anatta.
Man, those Buddhists were advanced thousands of years ago. They've been really working on this stuff.
You have no idea.
Oh, yeah. I have a little bit of a glimpse, and I'm like, man, they were pretty far out there.
When you look at Indian philosophical writings from 3,000 years ago, it's shocking how advanced they were.
Yeah, they've been civilized for way longer than humanity can remember.
Yeah.
So they get to inherit all the psychic echoes of the people who...
But like with the majority of the population, most people were not advanced, and they were just ugly people, just like the rest of us.
It's kind of true. We have a selection bias in America that people from India that we run into today are typically much more learned, and well, not today, but here they are the upper classes of Indians. So
that's who we let in.
Yeah,
that's who we seek. Right. We want the doctors. We want the computer professionals,
and the people and the entrepreneurs that start the businesses and service the businesses, particularly in hospitality. They do a lot of hospitality for travelers. But they're fascinating people. Like I said, they've been civilized for far longer than any of us can remember, or any humans can remember, or any cultures can really remember or write down. I have some wacky, I wouldn't call them beliefs, just ideas that I love. And that's what a belief is, is an idea that you get attached to. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an idea that you will use, right? An idea that you use is, you might believe in transience and impermanence, but you're not going to use the principles of transience and impermanence when you're crossing the road. You're going to look both ways for a car. So I have some wacky beliefs that or wacky ideas that I love about how civilization and technical understanding as we know it is probably cyclical on scales further than cultures can remember. You didn't like these ideas. I loved them.
Go ahead.
That's one. I also do have an idea that I love about we are probably inundated with the actions of agents far beyond our comprehension that we just we're not even aware of. And there are analogs to certain particular actions that we have inklings of what could be going on, but we really can't differentiate between what those could be and what's really going on. The thing with the poltergeists, for example. So I have to start it with an analogy, if you have time to listen to this.
Yeah.
Okay, so the analogy is that there is a primitive island people who are downstream of a ocean current from an industrialized civilization, spacefaring industrialized civilization. We could just make them us, right? The industrialized civilization is us. And the island people can still be smart, but when a plastic bottle washes up on the shore, their explanation for that is woefully inadequate of what created the bottle or what the bottle actually is. They might explain it as this is some type of plant or perhaps some sort of jellyfish or some kind of explanation to it. You don't like what they're not going to get is that it's blow molded polyethyl terephthalate with a polypropylene cap it's polyethylene cap and polypropylene label on it that was used to contain sugar water for largely marketing trend reasons and other addiction purposes for some industrial. They're not going to understand that. They can't possibly guess that. Right? They don't have the context to do that.
That's right.
They don't even have the context to really differentiate between that and natural things. And the more rational, smart thing to do is to assume it's part of what they're familiar with or to disregard it entirely. But the thing is that the bottle was made for utilitarian reasons. If they happen to understand that you can unscrew the cap, or if it still has the cap intact, they might see that that has a great utility. It's very durable. It's great for carrying clear water. Great. Similarly, there is a phenomena that happens rarely, that washes up on our shore, that I do believe is probably the leftover junk from engineering on scales that we are not equipped to understand. But we can understand what this would imply, what the utility would imply. So an object is made up of many jiggling particles, Brownian motion. And the Brownian motion causes this object to be stationary. The average momentum of them is net zero, and it emanates some heat, some black body radiation, and it also has some conductive properties, right? Mm-hmm. There is a non-zero probability, it can do this, where all of the particles align, superalign, Brownian superalignment is what it's called. They align in a particular direction such that this drops its momentum in the term of heat. It gains momentum in the term of relative velocity. It drops temperature and it moves on its own. We recognize that as a violation of the second or third law of one of the laws of thermodynamics.
Yes.
That's a violation of entropy. We violate entropy all the time. That's what intelligence does. Mm-hmm. It locally violates entropy at the expense of total overall entropy to a larger thing. Mm-hmm. The phenomena which I described of Brownian superalignment is in line with what we report as poltergeist phenomena, where there's cold spots and a thing flies off a shelf on its own. Okay? There's reports of phenomena of this. We don't have the context to tell what it is, to differentiate that from that mm-hmm. bottle from a plant or whatever, or that person from being a kook, or maybe a vibration from like a jackhammer somewhere and the thing falling off the shelf on its own. We don't have the context to conceptualize that, to differentiate that. However, if that's true and that's what's going on in some of these cases, we can immediately understand the utility of this. because if this is true and there's some way to Brownian superalign, I want the following phrase to be etched on my star drive. I want it to say that entropy is merely a statistic. That's what I want on my warp drive, if that's true. So, I mean, could you imagine being able to locally root out entropy on the subatomic level? And look, again, what we do is we lower entropy locally on like the scale of grams and kilograms and kilotons, right? And also going down to nanograms and stuff. We lower entropy. You need to lower a lot of entropy to produce a semiconductor chip. And if this keeps going, we'll get down to the Brownian motion kind of stuff where we can engineer superalignment. And when we do see friggin' cereal boxes and shit fly off of shelves, it probably isn't a spirit or a higher intelligence directly trying to communicate with us, just like the bottle that washed up on the shore isn't a message or an envoy from civilization. It's junk. It's a byproduct of something that you'll never guess what it is. It's just way out of the point. And one, I see that technology is going that way. If we continue to go with technology, you will see that utility captured. Right? Because we go down, we lower the scale of how much we can locally route out entropy. It'll eventually get there anyway. But this fits all of the criteria to be plausible. And the interesting thing is I really don't care too much about warp drives or whatever. I mean, even though that's really freaking cool on its own. What I care about is what are if this is possible and it's being done, what are the entities doing it? How long have they been around? What about those things, right? I'm more interested. I don't care about the bottle. I don't even care about injection blow molding. I care about the civilization. Like, that's really interesting. The industrialized civilization is very interesting, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what are these enormously, what about these intelligences that, if they exist, which they might not, in fact, Occam's razor, they probably don't, but there's good signs that this could be going on. What about them? What about what's going on up there? What kind of problems do they have? You know, I'm just very interested in that. And they're the subject of many a thought experiment for me. And I classify thought experiments about, okay, like what are the plausible scenarios in which a hyperintelligence could arise? You know, it's probably not going to be large groups of meatbags like us. It's probably not going to be space humans. If it is something like intergalactic or interplanetary or interstellar, it's probably going to be like, you know, von Neumann probes on the tiny scale. It's probably going to be something to do with like computronium. It's probably going to have these sorts of physical limitations, and it's probably going to have these problems. Like, you know what the biggest problem for those people are going to be, or those entities? It's heat. It's shedding heat. That's going to be their biggest problem. It's like, how do I dump and get rid of heat, and where do I put it? And likely what they would be doing is they're probably going to be blasting out infrared, or not even infrared. They're probably going to be blasting out extremely high energy radiation, but narrow bandwidth high energy radiation. We don't actually see that anywhere in the cosmos as far as I know. I mean, gamma ray bursts, but there's a natural explanation for gamma ray bursts. So, yeah, that would be a physical sign. You'd also be seeing systematic darkening of stellar mass. They would have to starlift out stellar mass. That's the easiest, lowest entropy way to sequester matter energy is starlifting. So stars would get darker, and the metallicity of this. You would use the star to produce higher, higher proton count, denser elements. So the star would just basically be a forge. You would feed it gases, you would starlift out the heavy elements, and you'd keep that son of a gun going. And you'd also capture the energy that it makes in the meantime and beam it over to your friggin' Jupiter brain or whatever that you have going over here doing enormous computations. That's probably what another civilization, that's probably what they would do.
I think that's beyond the capacity of humans.
Yeah, not something meatbags will do. Something that meatbags will initialize, right? There was a quote. I don't know if it might have been Ted Kaczynski. the Unabomber, who said, "We are the sex organs of the machine world." Like, Ted Kaczynski offered, like, did you ever read Ted Kaczynski's papers?
I did not, no.
They redacted.
I know who he is.
They redacted the heck out of him. And for those who don't know, Ted Kaczynski is the Unabomber. He was the guy who...
I know who, yes.
I know you know.
Yeah.
He killed researchers.
Yes.
Because he was really scared of the implications of technology. Now, what we want to believe about Ted Kaczynski is that he's like this terrible monster who killed, and it's true, at an angle from a very sane, rational person. He is a terrible monster who set the clock back substantially on the advancement of technology. But then when you read Ted, he offers a very cogent and valid critique of modernity, but also offers no coherent alternative. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, hey, look, you guys are inventing a hell for yourselves. If you want to be human, like a human, for much longer, you should stop, and we should stop, because you're gonna make some really nasty stuff for yourself. That's true, but it's not like we can stop that. So we are unconsciously and unthinkingly just advancing technology and sequestering more of our lives away from ourselves. There's all kinds of wonderful fallacies that you have to battle. My favorite battle is having to, well, actually I hate this, but I regularly have to try to convince optimistic communists that not everything can be automated. This should be plainly obvious to people. It's always people from the left that are like, oh, we're going to automate everything that humans do. No, listen, this is not what automation does.
That affects our qualia.
Automation?
Automation. If we're going to automate everything that humans do, what's left for us? There are many people who actually take great joy, for example, in going to work.
Yeah. It's an integral part in people's identity.
Yes, it really is. And for many people, that's their primary social contact and interaction.
Love of labor is generally regarded as a fallacy, but I don't think I disagree with what you said. Right, what you said is informationally true. Work is the primary social contact for many people, and it's the primary source of identity and meaning for people's lives. Going back to automation to explain the phenomena of automation and the phenomena in relation of labor, and more importantly, the expectation that people have that is just patently untrue. People expect that when you automate a job or when you automate a task, that decreases the net consumption of human labor. It does not. It increases the net consumption of human labor, and it increases the yield on that labor. Okay? So this is just true if you look at, as we invent new technologies, there are more people employed. And in order to employ more people, you invent new technologies and new forms of automation. If you think of a guy plowing a field with a cow, he plows the field less effectively than a tractor, but for the tractor to exist, you need to have the whole steel vertical, all of oil and gas, the electronic, blah, 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 and millions of people are involved in this long eye-pencil chain of supply chains to make the tractor come to being, to increase the yield on plowing. Mm-hmm. And this is done thousands of times over. Like we every time we come up on a new technology, we always expect this is going to free us from labor, and it's going to unlock so much time. When the computer was invented, we were like, oh yeah, clearly, like we very good, like, statisticians and people at the Department of Labor, like, looked down at what America was doing. We're like, look, the computer is going to automate like 40% of this. And it did. But it also demands that we do much more, right? So when AI comes to take our jobs or start driving cars for us or whatever, and very rational, smart people like CGP Grey look at what humans are doing and says, look, this is going to automate 40% of everything that we do. there will be more demand on human labor when AI comes around and starts automating large portions of what we already do. It always works like that. And it forever, every time you play this technology game, it sequesters more and more of your life away to labor. It's like going to it's a losing game. It's like going to the casino and expecting to come up. No, you do win money, but it comes at the cost of more money, right? This is how the casino wins. They make money, right? That's how it goes. This is how we employ people, is with technology. People were not employed, quote unquote, as like hunter-gatherers. They just survived. We had to invent agriculture for distinct roles. And then the rest is history. Literally, that's where history started. So, the relationship between humans and technology is, we have this strong bias and misconception that technology is a freeing thing. And it can be a useful thing in some cases. It can scale your civilization to a particular amount. But it's not good. It ends in our own extinction. We know this. This is inevitable. Ted Kaczynski was absolutely right about that. So the design of the world today and the design of that the world needs, the minimal change and reform that we need in order to survive the next 1,000 years or so as a species, is a really tall order politically. You're going to need to have at least trade union blocks that are self-sufficient with some trade between each other to not go to war because we have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. We need to get there. We need to start sacrificing technology and technological specialization and advancement for autonomy. We need to stop having all of our eggs in one basket. We need to have units, many cells and units that are deliberately sacrificing production output for resilience. Because when the next whatever happens, it might be able to take out those trading cells, but it will stay isolated to those cells. It won't take down the whole system. So we need to start building in resiliency to how the global economy and how our global civilization works. Now the problem is there's many perils in going in that direction. When you have trade blocks, you are much more like what we had 100 years ago, where there are competing empires that compete for trade routes, and they compete in this lovely little thing we call war. So right. You need to have a certain amount of trade that's guaranteed between the trade blocks to prevent war because we have nukes, but you also need a certain amount of autonomy and sacrifice of production in order to make sure that we are still resilient and that one little hole doesn't sink the whole ship. And these are both very hard balancing acts. Any one of these is very hard to accomplish in and of itself, but you need to do both of these two things simultaneously and in perpetuity. That's what is required for us not to nuke ourselves. So I give us a slim chance. I give us 7% for the next 100 years.
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree with you.
Yeah. Also, another thing, the people who are in control of the globalized society are not the people who are able to take the initiative and chart the course. They won't do it. They will defend their positions. That's what they'll do. I mean, they're selected and trained and bred, in fact, bred to do that. Right? They are raised to get a good job and defend that job, right? So they're not worried about the welfare of others or the chart or the course of history or anything. They are worried about how do I keep my job. Oh, we are so screwed. So
yeah, it's sad. I've often thought that I'm glad that I'm the age I am, and I don't have to face the future. Your generation is not going to have it as easy as mine.
No, we're not.
And we had it rough. There's a threat of nuclear war over our heads most of my life.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had weeks where every day there were dozens of crisis vectors.
Yes.
Okay, coming up, we will have decades where every day there are thousands of crisis vectors. That's unsurvivable.
It's unsurvivable.
Right? We are in Thucydides' trap now with China. We have two globalized superpowers that are carving away influence from one another, and we also have the pressures of growth limitation, right? We have globalized the whole world, and we are going to hit the the carrying capacity limits, where growth, which is which is a necessity for the financial system, growth is no longer going to be sustainable. This is the situation we're in. We don't listen to people who have the foresight, or have foresight who will tell us things that are tall orders, are very difficult goals to meet. When we come in contact with those people, we tear them down because it's uncomfortable. We don't uplift those people. We suppress them, and we listen to people who are trying to keep their job. So the people who are trying to keep their job tell you everything's okay and that we can manage it. We can just do this little bit of reform right here and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's like we're sleepwalking through a 8-line superhighway, right?
Now, I thought at the beginning of this conversation, you said you were conservative. These are not conservative ideas. These are radical ideas.
No, I think that they're conservative in that you have to exercise forethought and foresight in order to preserve your species, in order to preserve things. I'm fundamentally, all of these things are fundamentally against unsustainable processes.
That's correct.
And that is the act of conserving, is to halt the unsustainable process. It's not neoconservative. Conservatism, I'm putting quotes around them, are words that have changed their meaning in my lifetime. Yes. Liberalism is doing that now. I would say that the ideas that you're expressing belong with Barry Goldwater. Yes. 1950s, 1960s, not with what conservatism has currently come to mean. Right. In which case, if that is the case, then I'm in agreement with you. Yeah, no, I would say Barry Goldwater. The terms are evolving. It's like saying, oh, I'm gay. It doesn't mean I'm happy anymore. You true. Don't go around saying stuff. The word has changed its meaning. Totally different connotations. In my lifetime, so, anybody who says that now, instead of getting laughed at, may get beat up. Probably not nowadays. Yeah, probably not nowadays. But so this changing of conservatism and also the upcoming changing of liberalism, there's a dynamic there that drives this. I would classify myself as a conservative, right? But I would not classify myself as a neoconservative, and very few conservatives would. And what is the phenomenon of neoconservatism? Well, every generation has a dominant ideology that tends to flip-flop, okay? It tends to oscillate back and forth. In every generation, the preservation of power, the advantage of some people over others, needs to adopt a face of the dominant ideology. So for the baby boomers who were conservatives, the neoconservative movement came along and wore the face of conservatism and did what power does, which is consolidate more power. We want to go to war with Vietnam. We want to print money. We want to extract natural resources at unsustainable rates. We want to defend our positions against upcoming people. We want to have increasing control over your lives. We want to spy on our own citizens. These are not conservative things, but they were done by power wearing a conservative face. All right, now a new generation is coming along, the millennial generation. And power is still the same power, still the same goals. We want to consolidate power, have more control over your life, invade other countries, all of the great things that come with the dynamics of power, but is now wearing a liberal face. We're doing that, but we're going to have Kamala Harris in the president's seat, and we're gonna drone bomb some kids in Syria, but it's gonna have a rainbow flag on it. It's a superficial facial thing, and there's nothing inherently wrong with liberalism as an ideology as it is, or conservatism as an ideology as it is. It is always the problem that we have is the difference between people and power. Power is the advantage of some people over others to further their own causes at the expense of others. That's the nature of power. Yeah. And people naturally and instinctively understand that to be something that they're against. So the reason why kids today are quote unquote liberal is because they're not neoconservatism. They're not the power, quote unquote, and the power will shed the conservative mask and adopt the liberal mask. And then a generation from now, maybe if we last that long, it will be conservative again. We will abandon the power. We'll say, gross, that's really gross. I'm just not that. I'll be quote unquote conservative or whatever, right? So the left and right dynamic do not hold up as well as the liberty versus power dynamic, right? This is why I'm really a libertarian, right? Libertarians are about maximizing liberty. Incidentally, they have very little power, right? On one end of the spectrum is liberty, on the other end of the spectrum is power, right? So if you're a libertarian, you're not going to have any power. This is how it goes. As a political party, it's not going to go anywhere. As an ideology, you're going to be the most ideologically consistent and stringent ideology by far. So that kind of explains the political landscape and how it flows and changes from generation to generation. But I do consider myself primarily a conservative because I'm mostly interested in conserving. I'm not primarily concerned with liberating because that's not the problem that we have now. We don't live under a lot of oppression, though liberation is an important thing, and we do have goals for further liberation. Largely, we are more Brave New World than we are 1984. So conservatism is a better counter to Brave New World.
Think of what you said earlier in our conversation. You're saying the opposite now.
What?
You were talking about all the control, manipulation. We were talking about media, mass media. We were talking about, we mentioned Walter Cronkite. I mentioned Walter Cronkite. Tucker Carlson. You mentioned Rachel Maddow and so on and so forth. And control and manipulation and so on and so forth. And now you're talking about things that are just the opposite. So I think what is happening, the dynamic here is that you have ideals. And they're not in accordance with the realities and I think that's what you were discussing and railing against earlier, were the realities and that they are opposed to the ideals that you're espousing now.
So let me make sure I'm following you. The the contradiction is before I was criticizing elements of control, and then just now I'm criticizing elements of liberalization, right?
Very good.
Okay, so the control of people can be done two ways. This is what I had mentioned. You can do Brave New World, where you control people with pleasure, or you can do 1984, where you control people with pain. Yeah. And liberalization, there's two axes. There's the pain versus pleasure axis, and the control versus liberty, or the power versus liberty. So right now we are quite controlled, but it's with pleasure. We are more Brave New World than we are 1984. Now, if truly conservative people were in power, if power was wearing a conservative face, you would have more boot on the face 1984 type oppression. Now, what's more important is that when you have 1984, it's important to be an advocate for liberalism, right? Move it closer towards liberty. And if you are having control via pleasure, it's more important to control that, or not to control, but to counter that with conservatism, with moderation. So when we have overconsumption, conspicuous overconsumption, or ideological blinders on to any particular thing, that can be done liberally, right? I would describe that control factor, that control of pleasure, as a liberal process, where yes, go ahead and be, I don't want to say like socially degenerate, or be accepting of things that should bear some criticism, right? We allow people to do anything goes as free speech, right? And expect no consequences.
Yes.
And that's a toxic element of liberalism that needs to be controlled with self-censorship. And
I would not call that a toxic element
of liberalism?
Not in the least bit.
Anything goes?
That's a toxic element of irresponsibility.
Okay.
I would not put either a conservative or a liberal label on bad behavior.
Okay.
That's bad behavior.
Yeah.
Under any political, economic ideology, that's bad behavior. I would not put those labels on it. It's not a liberal thing. It's not a conservative thing. It's bad behavior.
I agree. I can see what you mean.
It's a matter of social responsibility, of acting in ways that are mature, rational, responsible.
Right. And that wouldn't be considered conservative, right?
That would not be considered conservative, nor would that be considered liberal. That's just bad behavior.
I don't mean conservative and liberal specifically as identifying with like Republicans or Democrats. I mean conservative as in like conserving yourself, like self-doubt would be more of a conservative thing. Expression would be more of a liberalizing thing. I guess I mean them as...
use those words that way.
It's just semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you don't like that, if you don't like them using that way, then they won't be used that way.
No. Just because I don't use things that way doesn't mean they're wrong.
Right, it's just,
or even that I object to them.
Right.
It's a matter of understanding a different perspective, that's all.
Right. But, I mean, right now, would you agree that of most of the control, of most of the power that's being exerted over people, most of it is done through pleasures, Brave New World style, rather than through Paine's 1984 style?
Not only would I agree with that, this is what advertising and manipulation and what we see coming across, the huge amounts of data gathering by people who are trying to control us, online tracking and...
Cambridge Analytica.
Exactly. So I'm in full agreement.
Yeah, that's...
And it goes on regardless of what company is doing it. It goes on a massive scale. Google does it. I have software called TrackOff, and it shows me who's tracking me. And like BBC is where I go for a lot of my news, and what are they tracking me for?
Lots of cookies. Well, they're dragnetting data.
That's exactly what they're doing, and
this is such a particularly dangerous evolution of technology.
And then they send. I don't get ads. I have ad blockers.
Yep.
I don't get ads, but they target people with advertisements based upon what they like and dislike and sites that they visit and so on and so forth. And this is neither liberal nor conservatism. This is greed.
I would agree.
Bad behavior.
I would see the manipulation of people's pleasures through advertisement and those kinds of things. As
you had mentioned that, exactly.
Brave New World. I would see that as that. I would classify it as left-wing rather than right-wing. However, I would see spying on people and sending men to your house with guns to arrest you and disappear you as 1984 stuff. And that's not happening. Thank God. Between the two, I'll take Brave New World over 1984.
But it is happening. It is happening in this country. If you're a criminal, if you're suspected of drug dealing,
right.
If you're a minority, if you're an illegal immigrant.
Well, it's not illegal to be a minority.
It is not illegal to be a minority, but minorities are targeted.
That's true. Illegal immigration. Man, Trump kicked up so much muck with that. Our country used to turned such a blind eye to illegal immigration. Where
My grandmother came here, 1892. She didn't have a passport. She didn't have a visa.
Yeah.
She didn't have even a birth certificate. She told me this herself. She got on a boat in Hamburg, Germany, got off at Ellis Island. They quarantined her for what, like 2 days to make sure she didn't have any infectious diseases. She came with her father. And then, have at it. Bye.
When was
She never legally became an American citizen.
that? Was your grandmother?
My grandmother.
Okay, so your grandmother was
She came over in 1892.
1892. Okay, so
I looked at all the Ellis Island records.
that's got to be interesting to hold history in your hands like that. Yeah, so America at some point was importing just whoever it could get that was
60 million immigrants came from Central and Eastern Europe in the late 1800s.
60 million. And
60 million.
we were trying to populate.
Just come.
Yep,
Get on the boat.
we were-
That's it. Pay the fare.
We were expanding our territory by stealing it from other nations
Yeah.
and screwing over indigenous peoples, and we needed to populate that land, man. So we were hoovering them up, but we are out of land. We are out of land. We're not
So is
expanding
every
land.
other country. We're not out of land.
Well, we can still develop much more.
China, we have 350 million,
Million, yeah.
whatever it is, 320 million, whatever. China has 1 billion added on to that.
Yeah, 1.2 billion.
Yeah.
I think it's 0.2.
And so does India. India is 1/3 our size, and
1.1.
China is roughly equivalent to our size.
Right.
We have plenty of land, and we still have plenty of resources.
What I mean is we are not actively stealing land from other people and then putting immigrants up to secure the land. We have the land secured. I agree that we can still, and America does take on over 1 million immigrants a year.
Yeah.
We do great with it, and those are legal immigrants. Our illegal immigrants are largely seasonal workers, and there's so many debates and things to be had about immigration
But they
itself.
used to come legally across the border as seasonal workers.
They darn well should. Now they just generally a lot of the illegal immigrants just like overstay their visas.
Yes. And a lot of them are not crossing the border on swimming the Rio Grande.
No, that's
The
largely
biggest, yeah, the biggest influx seems to be coming from Southeast Asia and Asia.
I don't know. My ideal immigration policy is I don't even have an ideal
What
immigration.
about the estimated 1 million illegal immigrants from the United States
and Mexico? Yeah.
I'd mentioned this. You
Yeah.
remember.
America exports some illegal
I
immigrants.
was in Soho in London, and I went to a shop. And this lady waited on me. I said, "Where are you from?" She said, "Oh, you've never guessed." I said, "Try me." She came from a small town in New Jersey. I recognized her accent, like about 15 miles from where I grew up. And she and I got to talking. She said she just came, never went back, was working illegally. It's a global problem. All of the African immigrants who are going across the Mediterranean into Europe, all of the Arab immigrants who are coming up through the Balkans into Germany and so on and so forth. It's a global problem. We look at it as an American problem because...
Hello. Jamel's not in. Y'all busy back there? Oh, we're shooting a podcast. It's okay. We're just recording. We're not streaming.
Jamel already left?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. See y'all the next time.
Alrighty. If you need me to pass a message on, I will.
No. I'll call him.
Okay.
And
Thank you
it's
so much.
about the time I need to leave. Anyway,
It's decent.
I'm in the process of moving, and I got to notice that they're changing the keys, changing the locks. I have to go pick up my key, otherwise I can't get into my apartment.
Oh, that's a good reason to have to get. we left on illegal immigration is a global phenomena. I was going to dispute whether it was actually a problem or something we could turn a blind eye to. and when you have to not turn a blind eye to illegal immigration. Where can that actually go wrong?
I don't have an answer.
Neither do I.
And one of the things that I discussed this with my brother, and he blew up at me, is that they're coming here largely to escape gangs, violence, drug dealers, cartels,
To pursue better opportunities for themselves.
to get away from the violence that's being caused.
Yeah, to get
and the market for those drugs is the United States of America.
And to get away from the consequences of policies that we put on them.
Yes. Yes.
It's terrible.
I mean, seriously, when you look at the big picture, they're coming here to get away from
what
us.
we did.
From what we did, honestly.
It's kind of true.
And
Not even kind of, it's absolutely true.
And, Brian, they're getting jobs.
Yeah.
I bet I could go into any restaurant here in Florence and go into the kitchen and find illegal immigrants washing dishes and cooking.
Probably.
I
mean,
could go
American
to any
cuisine would be
gas
far
station,
worse off for it.
any motel.
True. But I don't see that as a pressing problem that the
I don't
nation really
either.
has.
I really don't either.
Yeah. I see it as something that can be capitalized on because humans carry an implicit bias to the message that, oh, that other group of humans over there, they're really trying to get us.
Yeah, who's perpetrating that? The wealthy.
Well,
The
conservatives.
wealthy who are taking our money and blaming it on them.
Well,
and sending our jobs overseas.
And uniquely conservatives are susceptible to that because naturally they want to defend they are defensive. They want to defend their culture and defend their people. So when you give them a message of, hey, the other people over there are taking blah, 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 then they react to that. They're very susceptible to that.
Even though it's not necessarily true.
It's not necessarily a problem. It is necessarily true, but it's not necessarily a problem.
If our jobs hadn't been shipped overseas
Yes,
by
that's a good-
American corporations,
Right, siphoned off.
seeking cheaper labor and maximizing profits, these people our steel industry would still be strong, and so on and so forth.
Right. No, I don't disagree. I don't disagree at all.
After World War II, the United States produced 60% of the world's goods and services. Well, look at what the rest of the world was.
We still produce like a
it's in
quarter or
shatters.
so. Yeah. We still produce like a quarter or so.
And
America's still quite
I really
productive.
do have to go.
Yeah, let's
I
get-
want to keep talking too.
Yeah. All right, let's get. But this was fun.
Well, thank you very much for